Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, China calls for restraint amid the worsening battle over tariffs with the U.S. after Trump administration made the threat of a far broader 10% duty. Is there a way to pull from the brink of a likely all-out trade war? And in remembrance of World Refugee Day, I got up close with the former chief of the humanitarian group Doctors Without Borders, who tells us about sea efforts to save refugees bound for Europe and shares his own experiences in the most dangerous places on Earth. Let's begin our program today with threats of more U.S. tariffs. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose a 10% tariff on $200 billion US worth of Chinese goods, worsening a tit-for-tat trade spat with China. The Chinese side has urged the Trump administration to stop damaging words and actions, and also criticizing recent tariffs as a flip-flop over signed trade deals. Besides China, the U.S. trade also drew flack from its northern and southern neighbors, including transatlantic allies, in a tiff over aluminum and steel tariffs earlier this month. Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are getting worse. The Ministry of Commerce said China would lose no time in carrying out a series of comprehensive retaliatory measures. The statement came after Mr. Trump threatened to levy a new 10% tariff on $200 billion US worth of Chinese goods on Monday. The White House last Friday announced a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. The Foreign Ministry again emphasized China doesn't want a trade war, but isn't afraid of one either.
I have to point out that the U.S. remarks confused the right with the wrong, and they made irresponsible accusations against China with the aim to cover up its own unilateral and protectionist moves. Recently, in disregard of our consensus, the U.S. demonstrated another flip-flop to ignite the trade war. It has lost its credibility to the people around the world and harmed the interests of the two peoples, the interests of the two countries, the enterprises of the two countries, as well as the interests of the people around the world. We don't want a trade war, yet we are not afraid of a trade war. We will continue to take effective methods to safeguard our interests, and we will also firmly uphold the economic globalization as well as the multilateral trading system.
China is not alone in taking on the U.S. over tariffs. Russia says it will impose duties on American goods in response to U.S. tariffs on metal. The U.S. in March introduced a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports from Russia. Moscow expects to lose a combined $3 billion US over the metal tariffs. At the beginning of June, the U.S. levied steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. Canada and EU countries are also set to retaliate with tariffs on a variety of American products, which will take effect next month. Mr. Trump's tariff policy does not sit well with all its trading partners, leaving the world's biggest economy the odd one out.
For more on the global impact on the worsening trade spat between China and the United States, let's turn to our panel. In Beijing, we have Yukong Huang, a senior associate at the Carnegie Asia program. Welcome, sir, to our Beijing studio.
Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you this time. Also in Beijing, Liu Baozhang, who's the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Calgary, Canada, Carlo Day, the Director of the Center on Trade and Investment Policy at Canada West Foundation. Welcome as well. May I start with you, Mr. Huang? You brought a lot of information coming from Washington. But so help us to untie this mystery about what exactly the United States wants to achieve, given the fact that China, Canada, EU members have all decided to fight back?
Well, that's the mystery, of course, because depending on who you are and where you sit.
You're sitting here, I'm sitting here, so what do you say?
Coming from Washington, the same question is being asked. What is it they want? And the issue could be very simple. I want to lower the trade deficit. It could be, I want to change the terms that investment is flowing. But suppose it's something actually much broader. It's the great power relations, the systems which govern how trade and investment flows. Suppose Trump actually wants to change that system because it thinks that America has been disadvantaged under the previous rules, and now he wants to establish a different kind of regime to discuss these issues.
All right. It could be as immediate as the numbers. It could also be as so-called visionary as the overall global trade system. Mr. Liu, Professor Liu, what do you think about Dr. Huang's assessment?
Well, I pretty much agree, but the U.S. basic logic is that I'm taking unfair advantage of by the whole world, and now it is me, Donald Trump, who is there to get even because you know, my predecessors did a bad job, and now I'm going to correct it. But now he is really igniting a bomb that can really hurt the whole world, and including the United States, because the world are really retaliating against them, and this is really just one step. You know, there's going to be more blows ahead.
Well, really, the world, let's ask our Canadian guest. Mr. Dade, I mean, Canada has decided trade steel and aluminum coming July. You're going to impose more tariffs on the U.S. goods as well, ranging from farm products to the others. But what about that? Is this only like a storm in the teacup when it comes to allied relations? At the end of the day, Canada, United States, no matter where the trade goes, it's going to come back to where it was. Is that going to happen?
Well, in the longer term, sure, but you know, as the famous joke about economists in the longer term, we're all dead. So there's going to be much damage done, I think, till we get back to a post-Trump era where we begin to rebuild the rules of international trade. I think what the Trump administration is trying to do, and living right next door to the Americans, we've been dealing with this for quite some time, but they're trying to renegotiate the terms of international trade on the one hand. On the other hand, the Americans really have talked themselves into a corner here. We've had generations in the U.S. saying NAFTA was the worst deal ever. The rules of trade are set against the United States. China is the enemy. China is trying to steal your job. And after generations of that, it's taken on a life of its own in the U.S. And you're seeing an administration that feels bound not at all by the international rules, that has no cognizance of the history of how we got here to the current world order, and is willing to follow the current mood to destroy it.
Well, Dr. Huang, your time to respond to that.
Well, I think part of the problem we have is the basic premise that America started this trade war with was that America had become disadvantaged by the system. The trade deficits are actually bad. So we economists, like myself, we basically actually say that trade deficits are neither good nor bad. It doesn't actually matter.
It's just a matter of fact.
Okay. And then the second assumption is a lot of these problems were caused by China in some way, because China has such large surpluses. And when you think about it, America's had a trade deficit for 40 straight years. How could it do this? And the answer actually lies in the fact that the dollar is a global currency. If the dollar is a global currency, it essentially automatically guarantees that America will have a trade deficit. This has nothing to do with Canada's policy, nothing to do with China or Europe. So the premise in some ways in which I would say America launched the trade wars on the assumption that deficits are being caused by others, the actual cause of it is because the dollar is a global currency, and this role of having the dollar as a global currency, economists call this the exorbitant privilege.
Well, as complicated as phrases that economists use, that's why the so-called constituencies would not even listen to dearly what you had to say, Dr. Huang. And therefore, this is a matter of fact that this administration wanted to do something. And they wanted to do something. Now China is the target. Now Canada is the target, and now EU countries, some of them are the targets. So what's going to happen as a result if they wanted to do something to what we're going to have in the future? I think that is the question.
But if your goal is to symbolize and show to the general public that you've addressed the issue with some punitive actions, the simplest thing to do is to levy a tariff, because it's very simple and understandable.
It's outdated, simple, and it is not the best way at all, but that is what is being done right now.
It serves the political, emotional needs of the administration.
So therefore, Professor Liu, is there, as a result of this, going to be domino effect? That after all, the biggest economy in the world, United States, can just levy heavy duty on the other countries, whether it's China, Canada, or some of the EU countries on steel and aluminum at least. So the other economies could act and do the same to the weaker economies of their own and say, well, we're just going to do this because we're stronger.
Well,
and what can you do? Bite the bullet?
I think each country is there to have their own domestic politics to answer. So they have to show to their own people that they are standing against that. So they have to show a certain attitude. But now between China and the United States, for example, in the two biggest economies, it's not only the attitudinal issue, but it's a real interest fight. And it seems that each one are loaded in a different way, though, with enough ammunition to fight back.
Yeah, we're going to talk about China and U.S. specifically, but for now, let's also talk about this multilateral trading system. As a result of what is going on right now, what might happen, whether it's WTO, whether it is our belief in multilateral trade, belief in coming to consensus through negotiation, will that ultimately change, Mr. Dade?
Well, the WTO is actually a system established largely by the Americans, obviously with help from the other leading economies over the past few decades. But it's been designed for with American advantage in mind. A set of global trade rules that would allow trade to increase would naturally benefit the world's dominant, the hegemonic economy in the globe. That being the U.S. We tend to think of trade as a series of bilateral deals. Australia just signed a deal with China. Canada has a deal with Chile. We forget that at the basis of all of this, we have 170 some odd trade agreements around the world. That's the WTO. Canada does not only have an agreement with the U.S. and the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, we have an agreement with 170 other countries around the globe through the WTO. So it's a fundamental basis that allows us to trade. The issue is we don't explain this to people, and this is the deeper issue. In Canada, we did not take the decades of NAFTA to explain the benefits, we being folks like myself and your guest, the governments, private sector that benefited. And there was this buildup of resentment and misinformation about the agreement. And we're seeing the same thing happen with China now and the WTO. So the real warning out of all this for us is for people like us to be able to communicate more effectively to more people the benefits of the global trade system.
Well, I guess it is time to warn, but probably it's already a little bit late to warn because that's already happening right now. The apparent changes coming from the United States. Therefore, Dr. Huang, this is my question. Does the U.S. know where it is driving itself together with the rest of the world and its trading partner too?
Well, it begins with the premise that the White House feels. One, it does not believe in multilateral solutions anymore. It believes in bilateral negotiations. It sees this as a transactional approach. So whether it's a WTO system or even a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, or bilateral NAFTA or trilateral relationships, U.S. feels as a great power, it can gain more by dealing with each country one-on-one.
Oh, wait. Dr. Huang, one verb you use is very interesting. You say U.S. feels. What is backing so-called feels?
What is backing that?
You don't have to explain about the administration's policy because really it's not your job. I put you in the corner.
Because Trump believes, as a negotiator in the past, it can do better by talking to a country one-on-one than going through what I call a rules-based system where many parties are at the table. And that is what he wants to test out. And he believes very strongly on this. So that's why he basically comes at Canada, then he comes at another set of countries, and now he's coming at China.
Let's take a look at this transactional kind of negotiation style. So what's going to happen the next day and the next few days? Extremely important. China already decided, Mr. Liu, without necessarily saying the time to implement it, to retaliate against the United States. Also on 50B, U.S. goods to China.
Yeah, equal scale, equal strength.
All right. And future, China is considering the same proportion, so-called quantitative and qualitative.
Right.
After saying that, you also see the EU has decided today, EU Commission, 2.8 billion onto U.S. goods, particularly steel and aluminum. And then you also see Canada likely to work on that beginning from early July as well, as earlier talked about by Canadian Prime Minister and later adopted by the Parliament as well. So you already see chain reactions started by the United States, and then U.S. trading partners, as a result of being quote-unquote punished by the U.S., react. How far are we going to see this chain reactions? And who are going to be the losers of this chain reaction? Are these only the countries that are reacting to the United States, or actually the scale could be much bigger? Professor Liu, your thought here.
Well, basic estimate, the world economic growth now still in a very fragile stage will be put back by at least 1%. So everyone will be the loser. I mean the whole world population.
All right.
That's number one. Number two, when you're talking about the chain effect, is that different countries who are being affected have different lengths of the chain. For example, people always say, okay, when we have a common enemy, we can easily, form a coalition. But right now, for EU and Canada, they are on more specific issues than those, 301 issues,
we'll have our
etc.
Canadian guest to explain about his
That's right.
perspective.
So
but what about for
therefore,
China, for example? China, you've been getting the components, let's just say, of your products, which eventually being exported to the United States, coming from different economies, let's just say South Korea, some of the Asian economies, developing countries, second-tier or developed economies. So is there going to be an impact on these economies if China really having a trade problem with the United States?
Definitely. For example, we import, the animal feeds from India, for example, the soybean expellers, and then we feed our animals, and when we sell beef. And so, this whole thing, this whole global chain is being affected, and particularly in terms of the high-tech stuff. China buys all the pieces from all over the world, actually spare parts, etc. We are operating more as an assembly line for the whole world, and inclusive the United States. So when we are obstructed with the end market, the United States, so we are not able to buy those small pieces from the rest of the world.
U.S. companies that export to China also seem to have some experience already with the recent trade dispute. Let's take a look at what is happening. Those U.S. companies that export to China took hits in their share values. Boeing down 3% if you look at the latest stock market. Caterpillar 2.7%. Apple 1.5%. Those are just the number of those multinational companies that are now originally from U.S. operating in China as its biggest market in the world. Mr. Dade, what about that? How far do you think the chain effect will be, the rippling effect will be, for example, for Canada?
So, this is where there is some hope in all of this. We need a way out of this escalating tit for tat. And the way out we may see in history. In 2002, President George Bush imposed tariffs on imported steel to the U.S. Again, he did it right before the U.S. midterm elections at the time. The tariffs were supposed to last for 3 to 5 years. The Americans cut the tariffs in 18 months. Not because the WTO ruled against the U.S., but because the tariffs were such an economic and political disaster in the U.S. Congress was prepared to move to take back trade authority from the president, but the administration itself chose to rescind the tariffs because the damage was so great. In 2002, those tariffs were not applied to Canadian and Mexican steel, which were two of the biggest suppliers to the U.S. Now they are. So the one hope we have is that the economic blowback we saw in the U.S. in 2002 returns this time, and again forces either the administration to change course or Congress. And we've already seen a move in Congress to try and take back the president's, take trade authority that Congress ceded to the president.
Well, we haven't seen much sign from the Congress, that's for sure, except of the immigration policy. Dr. Huang, before we go, trade war. The other country so-called being punished, fight back or not? What has history taught us?
Well, history's told us in trade wars that if you don't fight back, you will clearly lose.
Why would you say so?
Because you've given the other side the signal that they can do what they want to do, and they'll design the tariffs and the quotas in such a way to get all the benefits and leave you with very little. And that's what happened to Japan several decades ago. So you have no choice in a trade war except to retaliate. And the hope then is that when you retaliate, in fact, you're making the other side realize that you're going to stand up for what you think you're going to have to do so. And in the end, a compromise will be reached. So when the pain gets great enough, a census then start to emerge, then you're going to find what I call some kind of a solution coming out of all this.
All right. We hope the pain would not be that much because the world's going to suffer as a result. But we'll see how things evolve from here. Thank you so much for your insights, the three of you gentlemen, for being with us. Yu Kong Huang, Liu Baocheng, and Carlo Date. Really appreciate it.